here. As you think about what takes place, verse 6, as 6, the brothers came and they bowed down before him with their faces to is. How long is it before you don't recognize someone anymore? Before you don't recognize someone, because a lot of people, this is kind of ridiculous, right? If this were a movie, some people would kind of, I mean, it's their brother. Surely they would recognize him. But let's remember, it's been 20, at least or about 20 years, right? He was 28, we talked about. Years later is when he's going to be called to Pharaoh's house. Now we've got the 7. And so, I mean, we're talking about some time. It's been 20 years. And that's not to say the fact, anybody ever had this, you ever had this happen to you? Right, in the doctor's office or the hospital, and then about a month later, you're at Walmart, and you see your doctor, and you don't recognize him because they don't have scrubs on, right? You don't see them in their natural habitat. Maybe it just happens to me, because I think it happens to me sometimes with the kids, right? Those of you who have little kids, suit and tie, and I walk up to them at the ballpark, they're like, who is this strange man talking to me, you know? I'm like, I'm not in my normal outfit, right? So how long does it take before you recognize completely different in what's going on? If he were to walk up and he were to say, you know, I say, hi, I'm Joel. If I walked up and I said, hi, my name is Phil Brown or something, they might say, oh, okay, nice to meet you, Phil. You know, this kind of just not only the look different, but the name is different, the situation is different. And that's exactly what's happening here with Joseph and his brothers. They say, do I know you? It's been 20 years. He's got a different name. He's going by Zaphanath-Paneah. He's got different dress. No doubt he's probably in his position high up, dressed like an Egyptian. We said a couple of weeks ago that when he goes before Pharaoh, or I guess that was last week, when he goes before Pharaoh, it says the first time he'd ever shaved. We think about the Hebrews growing out beards and that kind of thing, we believe. So maybe different dress, probably different speech. There's more on that to come in just a moment as they believe. And he contributed. Look at verse number 7. Joseph saw his brothers, recognized a stranger to them. So again, back to my illustration, he could have run up and said, hey, it's Joseph. And they might have said, as a stranger. Not only that, look down in verse number 23. Understood them, for he spoke to them through an interpreter. So I don't using, but he did contribute to this. He kind of kept it going, and we're going to talk about that as well in just a second. And so here we are. Number 6 says that Joseph's brothers bowed before him. In chapter 37, he seems like such a jerk to his brothers. And he has these dreams, and he talks about them. We might say by the grace of God. We might say by the power of God. We might say by the providence of God. Whatever you want to say, here we are, back where it all began, with them bowing before. Had they forgotten? You know, had they passed on from those earlier dreams and kind of put it out of their mind? Maybe they hadn't forgotten Joseph, but maybe they'd kind of put that instance out of their mind. Another, from a mental health aspect, sort of the human brain, they had a traumatic event in the fact that the actual putting him in the pit, selling him into slavery. So maybe they've gone past the dreams. Maybe they had. Whether they had forgotten or not, and whether they recognized him or not, Joseph had not forgotten. Verse 9, then Joseph remembered the dreams. So, he accuses them of being spies, right? Again, I'm going to kind of throw everything up here, but he accuses them of being spies. This is a serious accusation. This is not, I mean, they don't have drones and they don't have, tanks and military might, but still, the idea of a military or some kind of army or even secret intelligence officers is probably not foreign to them. On top of the fact that we're talking about the one place that has all the food, that has all the grain. I mean, it's right for people to come in and try to, take over these things and to wedge their way in. Some folks are perfectly happy and content to pay their money, to show up, to pay their money to get their food and go on. And maybe others in other countries are plotting to try to overthrow Egypt. So this is not some maybe totally random thing that he's pulled out of the blue, possibly. Maybe they've already had the trouble. Maybe this has happened more than once. We're not privy to it, but maybe it came up a week ago. And so then Joseph says, these are spies, picking up there in verse number 9, and makes a serious accusation that, hey, maybe this is a food takeover. Maybe this is them and they're coming for these this that we have stored up and how we are trying to help everyone. Of course, they deny it. Verse 10, no, my Lord, we've come to buy food. We're honest men. Your servants are not spies. But he says in verse 12, excuse me, back to this idea of, what they may be after, he says, verse 12, no, but you have come to see the nakedness of the land. And then verse 13, Joseph knows this because he remembers them. I mean, this is not an introduction, but he says, they say, your servants are drowned. It probably wasn't just him and them at this moment. It's other officers gathered around. So he just keeps saying it over and over again. So he decides there through the rest of chapter 42 and about verse 24, through that section, he puts them all 10 in prison. And he comes up with this plan. Whether this gives him some idea, gives him some time to think about it or not, we don't know. And one of the things that, let me ask these questions here. Let me scroll down to my notes here. I don't think I put this on the screen. So let me ask you to think for a moment, and we can talk about it in a minute when we get there, or you can offer some suggestion. But why did Joseph do all this way? Why did he deal with them, not just here, but through the rest of the chapters? Remember the money, the silver cup, the things we just put up there. Why did he do it in this format? Was he punishing his brothers? This is my revenge. This is why we talked about the movies a minute ago. This is my revenge. Was he punishing his brothers? Was he teaching them a lesson, maybe kind of hand in hand? Sometimes siblings feel like it's my job to teach my sibling a lesson, to show them they were wrong in this. Was he testing them? Why was he being so shrewd in these things? All three of those? Okay. I mean, that's a pretty good answer, maybe an easy answer. In connection with that, wanted to see him squirm. Okay, now that's one that I like as a consideration at least. I mean, I don't think we can say for sure, and maybe there's a little bit of all of this, right? We're talking about humans who are dealing with these things. Charlie? All right, now that's a really good one. And Tina and Charlie kind of hit on two of the main ones that I was thinking about. Charlie said, in case you couldn't hear him, he wanted to force them to let him see his little brother. And so I've suggested to you before Dr. Ed Gallagher's podcast from Heritage Christian University and the chapel sessions he did on this. And that was one that he talked about. And he made mention of this idea that maybe, and you can see it there almost, again, we're kind of reading into it, but verse 7, as he sees their faces and he speaks roughly with them, right? The New King James says there in verse 7, he speaks roughly to them. That maybe he is out for vengeance. Maybe he does want to see him squirm. Maybe he is upset, and this is my chance. Maybe he even wants to take their life. You guys caused me a lot of suffering, and even though I've ended up in a good position, I want to see you suffer. But Dr. Gallagher suggests, and it's just worth consideration and thinking about, that maybe when we get there to verse number 13, and they say the youngest is with our father today, the mention of Benjamin maybe changes his mind. And as Charlie is saying there and suggesting, maybe he is wanting to force them into letting him see Benjamin again. Because think about it. And again, I'm not saying this for sure. We can't say for sure. 10 brothers show up. Where's Benjamin? For all he knows, they've killed him too. I just mentioned the dysfunction that seems to be going on or seems to be continuing. He doesn't know what's happened. Now back to what Tina said, maybe he's testing them to see how they would respond. Maybe he was testing them to see how they treated Jacob and how they treated Benjamin. Had they mistreated Jacob? Had they been hateful to Benjamin? Had they tried to get rid of him?
They had forgot about Joseph because they even say here,
correct.
One of us is no longer.
Correct. And so
Identify themselves as being 12 brothers, but one of them, he's no more.
correct. And so I'm kind of getting ahead, and it's kind of hard to do this without going one way or the other, but either not saying it or kind of jumping to the end. But yes, again, Dr. Gallagher kind of suggests that maybe his anger which is subsided by Benjamin. He even still has more thoughts about this, but they prove themselves differently. They do remember. Maybe he thinks they've forgotten. Oh, they got their money. They got rid of me. They've moved on with their lives. So here I am. I'm going to get my vengeance. I want Benjamin to come to me, and I'm going to keep him here. And maybe he even thought then he would kill the other 10, because now I've got Benjamin here. But as Freddie is kind of suggesting here, it seems as if, they have changed. They do remember. They're not cold-hearted, hard-hearted killers or assassins. They feel bad for what they've done, and it comes up a couple of times here. So real quick, let me get back up to some of these, because we'll keep working through it, and keep that in the back of your mind, certainly, as we work through this here. So, I'll start overlaying this. Again, a lot of this comes from Dr. Gallagher. I don't want to take credit for it, but I thought it was very challenging and encouraging for us. So he puts him in prison for 3 days, maybe to give himself time to think. He's upset. He wants to murder him. Let me take a breather. 3 days go by. He comes up with a plan. His plan is to keep to keep 9 and send 1. Then maybe he decides, well, you know what? That won't motivate Jacob. If I keep 9 and send 1, he's not going to want to send Benjamin back. So maybe let's reverse it. I'll keep 1 and I'll send 9. That way I have some insurance. The whole goal here, possibly, the whole goal is to get Benjamin back. If I keep 9 and send only 1 back, then that's going to be a problem, and Jacob's going to say, no way, no how. But if I send most of them back and just keep 1, maybe that will help. So maybe he decides to keep the second oldest in Simeon, because of what Reuben says. Notice there, going down, I'm on the wrong page, sorry, in my Bible. Going down then to verse 40, chapter 42, verse 22. And here's where Freddie said what they said a moment ago again, verse 21. We are truly guilty. They feel some pang of guilt because of what they have done. So Reuben speaks up, says, did I not speak to you saying, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Therefore, behold, his blood is now required of us. And then the verse 23, that they didn't think Joseph understood, but he is listening and he does understand. And here's the first time, chapter 42 and verse 24, the first of at least 3 times that it moves Joseph to enough emotion that he turns and he has to leave, has to walk out. 4 times, I believe, he weeps. 3 times he removes himself from his brothers. That's chapter 42 here in verse 24. Chapter 43 and verse 30 is the second time. Chapter 43 and verse number 30. And then in chapter 45 and verse 2 as he reveals his brother. He and his brothers are going to reveal themselves there. So maybe it's Reuben, right? He wants to keep Reuben, but Reuben reveals himself as saying, hey guys, I told you this was a bad idea. And he says, well, we'll just keep moving down the list, right? Let's go with Simeon. So he holds on to Simeon and sends the rest back. Now, here's a recurring theme, as Freddie pointed out a moment ago. They feel guilty. They feel guilty for what they've done. They're not going to continue to act hard-hearted. They can't take it back, right? They believe he's dead. So once again, back to how long does it take you to forget what somebody looks like? You think somebody's dead, and you think you've seen a ghost? Now, they don't because they don't recognize him, but that's why, they are upset about this. They knew they were 12, but they are no longer anymore. So, let's see, point 3 there. I should have numbered these. Middle of the screen, he sends them home, sacks full of grain, the grain they were coming to buy, provisions for the trip home, and then actually their money back in their grain sacks. And so we're going to have to kind of hit this pretty quickly and over the highlights, but if you pick up in verse 25 and look through the end of the chapter 42, you'll maybe be reminded of some of this. They return. I saw one preacher or writer who said they return with hearts as heavy as their grain sacks. They've got a lot of food to last for a while, but their hearts are pretty heavy too. And think about this. As they go home, remember they find the issues, they find their money in there, and they are worried. They get worried about this. They know. Ever been innocent of something and nobody believes you? They know they didn't do it. Did you put your money back in your sack? No. Did you put your money back in your sack? No. I mean, they know they didn't put the money back in their sack, yet here it is. And I asked the question at the end because somebody asked it in the commentary I was reading. Maybe they're embarrassed. Well, why would they be embarrassed when they get home? Well, because there's 2 options here. Either number 1, they are thieves. They found somebody and they've robbed them of this money. Or number 2, they've sold Simeon. They've sold Simeon. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Truth is stranger than fiction sometimes, right? They've either stolen money from someone or they come home looking like guilty because they've sold off another brother. And so I ask you there at the end of the slide, how many times are you going to get fooled? Twice. This is twice. They've come home short a brother. Twice. How many times would it say for you to get up, really upset? Jacob was upset the first time, but here you come home again and you're short another brother and you've got this story and you've got this money. How in this world do you expect me to trust you all? Ever again. And that's kind of the message of Jacob, right? At the end of chapter 42, as they say, hey, here's what's happened. Here's what's supposed to happen. Verse 34, bring your youngest brother to me. And they keep referring to him as this man, right? We talk to this man. Verse 30, the man who is Lord of the land, the New King James says. So we talk to this man. This is what happened. Bring your younger brother. Verse 36, Jacob says, no way, no how. Not a chance. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So yeah, I'm not trusting you guys ever again. Don't worry. In fact, the chapter ends, then you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. He's already been heartbroken once, and really, there's kind of a connection here. It seems as if nobody's really worried about Simeon through this, right? Let's keep going. Go to chapter 43 then for just a moment. Chapter 43. So eventually they run out of food again, right? Verse 2 says, it came to pass when they had eaten up the grain which they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, go back and buy us a little food. They run out of food, and we know that a verse or two later what happens is they end up going back with, even down to verse 11 and 12, if you're looking along there. Verses 11 and 12. He says, go back with gifts, right? Almonds, nuts, spices, myrrh, all these things, and double the money. Take double the money. I don't know who this man is. I don't know how angry he is, but go back with double the money. And so it's interesting here that a character emerges, a person emerges. If you've been in this class, and I said I've done a lesson on this before, this story, the main person in this story is Joseph. But I don't know that the story is all about Joseph, because Joseph is there to preserve life. Whose life? Well, to some extent, Judah. We don't get to the line of Judah without Judah being still alive. Judah sort of emerges here as a spokesperson. In chapter 37, remember all the way back in chapter 37, the brothers listen to Judah. Judah's the one that speaks up and says, hey, let's sell them into slavery. They listen to Judah. Here in chapter 43, Jacob listens to Judah and says, okay, he relents. You might want to notice there that Judah also offers more than Reuben does. At the end of chapter 42, Reuben offers his two sons, right? You can have my two sons. Judah offers himself.
You can imagine the turmoil these brothers are just in during all this, because even back in verse 22, Reuben says in chapter 42, I told you not to sin against this child, because they thought they were being punished for what they did to Joseph. And he's like, I told you. And then over here in chapter 43, Jacob is saying, why did you tell the man he had another brother? They're just getting hit from all sides. And then Judah's like, well, he asked us.
Yeah, he asks very pointed questions. We're going to get to that here in just a moment, but very pointed questions. He basically say, he knew. What were we supposed to do? Our hands were tied, as we say. And so, yes, I'm not excusing anything they did, but Tina brings out a pretty good point. They're probably pretty much in turmoil here too. They're kind of in the spinner, as we say, going around. Our dad, our brothers, this guy, what's going on? We don't know what to do. They probably don't want to go back to Egypt. Can you send somebody else? Sure, we might take double the money in gifts, but what if he takes us in as slaves anyways, because knowing what we've done? And so Judah here kind of emerges as, in chapter 37, they listen to him. Jacob listens here, and we'll get there in just a moment. But in chapter 44, he speaks up. And Joseph is going to listen to him when he speaks up in Egypt. So, moving just through the timeline here, when they get back to Egypt, they're welcomed back, right? Verse 15, they're welcomed back in a kind of a good way. Joseph sees Benjamin, kind of has this moment with Benjamin. And then it says, let's see, in verse 15, they stood before Joseph, and he says about making, let them dine with me and make this animal ready. But in verse 18 it says, the men were afraid because they were brought into Joseph's house. So they're taken back into the house, and they kind of probably fear slavery here at this point, just a guess. But they're probably a little worried about the fact that here we've shown our face again. You know, we would stay in hiding, but we're showing our face again. And so there's a chance we're going to be enslaved or in trouble here. So I have on the screen there, they plead their case because it says in verse 18 that what they do is that or verse 19, they go to the steward. They go to the steward of Joseph's house and they begin to tell their story. Hey, man, this is not right. This is what happened. This is how we've been wronged. Verse 21, it continues on, and they're sort of telling what happened to them, to the steward. But he says in verse 23, peace be with you. Do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I had your money. And then he brought Simeon out to them. I said a few moments ago that it seems like they don't care about Simeon. You know what happens in chapter 42 and 43 there is they're debating about what's going to go back. Nobody says, we need to go get Simeon, right? Nobody ever seems to say, hey, what about our brother we left behind? Now, I'm not saying it didn't come up at all, but, you know, it's not given to us that way. Simeon's just left to kind of languish out there. They're worried about Benjamin. They're worried about themselves and these kinds of things. But it does say in verse 23 there that they are reunited with Simeon. And so they're treated well. They're seated for a meal with great surprise. And as you notice here, there's a few folks who are surprised. Number one, the Egyptians. All the jaws hit the floor, as we say, because the Egyptians are surprised. It says there that the Egyptians do not eat with the Hebrews. Verse 32, the Egyptians ate by themselves because Egyptians could not eat food with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. So we end up with these groups. Joseph's by himself, the brothers are by themselves, and the Egyptians are by themselves. Now, I'm not saying that's in different houses. It may not even be in different rooms, but there's at least this separation, because they don't do that. Maybe it's Joseph and his brothers in a room and the Egyptians in another room. But verse 33 tells us that their jaws hit the floor because of the seating chart. They are sat down in order from the youngest according to his youth. And verse 33 says, and the men looked in astonishment at one another. Now, that's not the end of the story there, because it tells us at the end of verse 34 that they drank and were merry with him. It seems to go well, at least for the evening here, because they are going to be able to spend this time together, and the party seems to go well. Now, thinking about what the brothers feel in this, notice that it says there in verse 34 that Benjamin gets 5 times what they get. Now you're kind of back to, if Tina is correct, that maybe he continues to kind of test them. You know, maybe he's going to kind of see how they would react. That's one of the things that, there's kind of 2 main schools of thought mainly, and one of them is the idea that, you know, he's testing them, and maybe it's left ambiguous for us to kind of interpret and to think about. And one is that he is ready and willing to forgive and to forget, but he needs to see something out of him. He needs to see what happened to Benjamin. Well, now Benjamin's with them, but let's see what happens when Benjamin gets 5 times more. I don't have a coat of many colors to give to him, but let's see if I give him more than what they get, and let's see how they respond then. In fact, Josephus, not Joseph, Josephus, the early church historian, said that Joseph did these things to make trial of his brothers and to see if they would stand by Benjamin or leave him. Now, that's not inspired, that's Josephus, but that's a possibility as well here with this. So, chapter 44 begins with that silver cup. The cup is placed in Benjamin's sack. At the beginning of chapter 44, he tells his steward to do this. That's kind of worth mentioning with this idea of a testing. If you believe it's a testing of his brothers, this makes sense because he tells the steward to do it, and then the steward is the one that goes and chases them down. So, you know, the steward's in on it, and maybe that's the plan here. They're sent on their way, and then they say, not again, right? Are you serious? And again, fingers at each other. You, me, did you? What's going on? Surely this didn't happen to us again. In fact, they believe it so much so that they welcome a search, right? Let's go. Get the bags down. I think it says that they do so quickly, right? Verse 11, then each man speedily let down his sack to the ground, and each opened his sack. Now, again, this can be found in all kinds of movies, cop shows, Law and Order, or whatever you like to watch. But, where somebody, yeah, absolutely, come check my car. And then there's the, bloody knife in the glove compartment or something. And they know they didn't do it, but there it is. And how do you deny that? So, yeah, they're quickly, absolutely, let's see it. Open them up. And there's the silver cup sitting in Benjamin's sack. Now, this is where Dr. Gallagher continues with his thought process, what Charlie said to us just a few moments ago. Maybe this is Joseph's final way of keeping Benjamin. Maybe the encouragement to the steward was, you find the one who has the cup, which the steward knew, find the one who has the cup, bring that one to me, and leave the others. And this is my way to get rid of the other 10 and to get Benjamin here with me. Again, just food for thought. But what does happen is they return together. They return together and they plead their case. Verse 13 says, they tore their clothes, each man loaded his donkey, returned to the city. And so Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, verse 14. And Judah is going to be the one in verse 16 and following that makes a speech, that speaks up. As we said a few moments ago, he emerges. He gives a pretty good speech. Verses 14 through 34 is about the section, and if you would have time to read it in the future, verses 14 through 34 is this speech. In fact, it begins in verse 16 with a confession. As Freddie said just a few moments ago, what shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? How shall we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Like Freddie said, that they're admitting to this. He begins with a little bit of confession. I think this speech comes from his heart. I think this speech is on behalf of his father. Maybe here's a brother who is upset and says, I understand. I watched him. I watched him in chapter 37, and I've watched him for 20 years more than my brother. It's really difficult to think about and even say, but people who sometimes lose a child and they won't even change their room, they won't go in, they won't touch anything in there, they want it undisturbed from the time whatever it was that happened that took their child. For 20 years, Judah says, I've watched him mourn and be upset. Not counting just there, the chapter 37, when he first finds, as we bring to him, this coat of many colors with blood all over it. And Judah says, maybe with a little more maturity, if it'll keep my father alive, take me. If it'll allow my father to live, then please, I will stay. In verse 31, your servants will bring down the gray hair of your servant, our father, with sorrow to the grave. Verse 33, now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. It's not even a question, right? It's not even really a question in Judah's mind. There ain't no way this is happening. I'll figure out how to do it, but you can keep me instead. And so real quick, we're just going to touch on this for a moment because I think some of this is going to spill over into next week anyways. But chapter 45, this is it, right? This is the position that all those revenge seekers want. Edmond Dantes in the Count of Monte Cristo, Maximus in Gladiator, we get to that point where you've got the upper hand, you've got their lives in the palm of your hand, and you are ready to take action. This is what everybody wants, and Joseph is there. And it says in verse 45 that chapter 45, as he makes everyone leave, because he's now had this sort of change of heart, maybe he's already changed his mind on killing them if he even wanted to do that, I don't know. But verse 2 says he weeps out loud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. You may not have heard that guttural cry, if not only on movies or television, but you know what I'm talking about. That feeling, that emotion, that depth of emotion. And so it tells us there that his brothers, through chapter 45, are dismayed. They are worried at the end of verse number 3. Now, my understanding is this word, the Hebrew word or the Aramaic word there for dismayed in verse number 3, is really only used elsewhere in the Old Testament for fearful armies who are assured of their death. The Edomites, I didn't write down all those verses, but there's 2 or 3 other places, including in the Psalms, where it's referenced that this army is on the brink of death, right? The brothers feel like the grim reaper is near for them. They are dismayed. Freddie? They're terrified. Knees knocking, collapsing, somebody passes out. I don't know, but you get the picture here. Dismayed may not do it for us because we don't use that word as often, but this is how they feel. And then the forgiveness, right? It is a story about forgiveness. I think it is. That's not, all that we've said is not to take away from that. Joseph gives a wonderful speech. This is a wonderful moment in Scripture when Joseph says these things, including, of course, verse number 7, one of the most popular verses of this section. God sent me before you to preserve life, to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. I've shared with you before that in the sermon that I've done, the question comes up, whose life? Whose life has he preserved? Has he preserved the Egyptians' life? Sure, he's preserved the Egyptians' life. They're benefiting from this grain. Has he preserved his life and his family's life? Absolutely. But maybe just underneath there, as we think about everything pointing the way towards Jesus, he's preserved Judah's life so that the Lion of Judah could come through this line later and Jesus is going to be able to come, right? So he's sent to preserve life, and he does. Real quick, I didn't get it on the screen, but let me ask you this. And you can answer if you want, but I don't think you can give a definite answer. At what point do you think Joseph realized that God's plan was at work or working? Go all the way back to chapter 37. At what point do you think Joseph realized that God's plan was working? And here's why I say, verse 7 tells us that in some way, at some point, he gets the memo. He gets the message. At some point, he begins to understand that this is it the first time? Is it the second time? Is it getting out of Potiphar's house? Is it getting out of prison? Is it being promoted? Is it when his brothers show up again? At some point, he gets the message, and he understands this. So real quick, because our next week is supposed to cover chapters 46, 47, really I think through the rest of the book, through the rest of Genesis. And then the last week on this section, I know some of you won't be here, but we're supposed to cover a little bit about Egypt. So if we kind of bleed over, that'll be all right. But the short version is the family moves to Egypt. And in an interesting note that we'll come up against later when we get to the 10 plagues, Pharaoh gives them the land of Goshen. Tina?
Thinking about Judah, you think about all those years from the time they sold Joseph into slavery up until this point, there's a lot that happens. Right after that, Judah marries that Canaanite woman, and all that happens with him, with Tamar and all that. Just look at what he learned. And then, because he leaves his family and goes off and marries a Canaanite woman, which is what they're not supposed to do, then he has the twins with her finally after his sons don't treat her right, and they're killed. And then they have the twins, and through one of those twins comes Christ, So he's learned so much, or he should have, through, and then seeing the grief that they put their father through all this time, He's lived a lot of life, and he should have learned a lot, which I think he has, which shows up why he's pleading so much for that.
No.
That's interesting.
Tina makes a good point that I don't care about any great storyteller you want to think of, Alexander Dumas, who wrote The Count of Monte Cristo, or Steven Spielberg, or anybody. Nobody tells the story as good as God tells the story. And all of them are pretty much telling the same story from when God told it, or allowed it to happen, or it came into being. And so absolutely, Tina takes us even further back to chapter 38 and some of those things. And The Count of Monte Cristo is a fine story of revenge and all these things, but it causes us to think a little bit about, well, this is kind of what happened here in a sense. Not the same way. Joseph's not exacting the same revenge as the Count does in that book and in that movie, but yeah, it's original with God. All of these things, because he created man. We are human beings, just as Joseph and his brothers were, and Judah was, and all these things, as we have said, so very challenging. I've got a few thoughts to finish, but what other things left here? We've still got a few minutes left.
I think that if Joseph had simply thrown them in prison or whatever, it would have been different on them. They got what they deserved, but the way he treated them, which is, of course, exactly the way God treats us too. He develops them to the point where they can truly repent.
Yeah.
And once they're
Yeah. That's kind of back to what we were saying a minute ago, and I think Dr. Gallagher's thoughts kind of help us think about that because, he tells that, that maybe these chapters, these specific chapters are about God preparing Joseph for the reconciliation that's coming. Because it's possible that as he meets them at the beginning of this, he wants to murder them. And he has the power to. He can make them disappear. All he has to do is say they're spies. All he has to do is say, hey, these guys are spies. Hey, you guards, come get them. And it's done. They'll take them out, bury the bodies, no more. Nothing else to worry about. But when they mention Benjamin, who's Benjamin? His only blood brother, his younger brother, the only one who he thinks was not a part of the plot to kill him, right? He wasn't even there in chapter 37. He would want to be reunited with him. In fact, he says this in chapter 42 and verse 15. Verse 42 and verse 15, by the life of Pharaoh, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. He says, this is what I want to some extent. And so the rest of his next steps are not to reconcile with them. Maybe it's not to test them, but it's to get back to Benjamin. And, they are the key. Maybe he doesn't care about them really, but he wants to, they're the key that he needs. And so he needs the plan. We talked about some of this already, but he puts them in prison. His anger calms, and he comes up with keeping one brother for insurance. Again, Jacob seems to write off Simeon. No, Jacob says, there's no way we're going back to Egypt. Y'all aren't going again. I'm not letting this happen. Simeon's never mentioned. No one ever says we have to go get Simeon. And so maybe Joseph's plan keeps not working, right? It keeps not happening the way that he wants it to happen. And so when he hears them talking, though, then maybe that he realizes then maybe that they do have this change of heart, as Freddie was talking about. They have not forgotten. They are not happy that he is gone. In fact, they felt guilty, and they feel that every bad thing that happens to them is punishment. And that's the first time that he weeps, that we see there. And so one way to look at this is that his anger towards his brothers, he wants to find a way to get Benjamin to them and get rid of his brothers, but they regret. They haven't forgotten. And so maybe that breaks his hard shell, his exterior, that he then changes. He softens his approach a little bit, but he still decides to go through the silver cup. Let's get Benjamin back here. The one who has it, he comes to me. But to Freddie's point, what do they do when the silver cup is found? They don't abandon him. They don't abandon Benjamin. Have they changed? Maybe. If it had been Joseph, they would have said, oh, sorry, he has the cup, just take him. We're going to go home to our dad. You can have him. But when it's Benjamin, for whatever it is, time, maturity, remembering, I don't know, but they don't leave Benjamin alone. They don't abandon him. If you're going back to Egypt, then we're packing up our donkeys and we're going back to Egypt with you. And we're going to stay with him. And so maybe Joseph's upset. They're back again. I thought I was getting rid of them. I really wanted Benjamin. Here they are again. I don't know. But then here comes this speech from Judah. This unexpected one maybe speaks up, and he leads to the reconciliation that God was preparing, but he wasn't preparing the boys for, the 10 for. He was preparing Joseph for this reconciliation. When we sometimes look back at Scripture, it's a little frustrating that we don't exactly know certain things and we can't see behind everybody's mind and what they're doing with everything. But there's still some good thoughts. And I hope that maybe this challenges you a little bit to think about those and to think about Joseph. Put yourself in Joseph's shoes. Absolutely. We do that a lot. That's pretty easy. Put yourself in the 10's shoes. Put yourself in Benjamin's shoes. Put yourself in Jacob's shoes and think about this. And we get to the point where they're welcomed back. Bring your family. Let's give you the land of Goshen, which will come back up in the book of Exodus, in particular with the 10 plagues. And then we'll move on from there. So I appreciate your good attention in the comments. We will pick up with the rest of Genesis next week, God be willing. Thank you.